Hello. In this episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Dr. Pablo Meninato, Associate Professor of Architecture at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture, Temple University, Philadelphia, about urban labyrinths, informal settlements, architecture and social change in Latin America, which he co-authored with Gregory Marinich and published with Routledge last year. As per the book's title, we and it focus on Latin America and explore examples of informality in Rio de Janeiro, Medellin, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, discussing the social, policy and spatial complexities of informal urbanism and how self-built settlements shape cities, challenge conventional architectural narratives, and drive social transformation. From favelas to barriadas, we examine resilience, adaptation and policy implications for equitable urban development.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking this evening, today, with Pablo Meninato. Pablo, before you introduce yourself, we're going to be talking about your book, Urban Labyrinths, Informal Settlements, Architecture and Social Change in Latin America, which you wrote with Gregory Marinich and published with Routledge this year?
Yes, in March 2024, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's a beautiful book, and it's a topic that I'm particularly interested in, but not as expert as you, which is why I'm looking forward to this so much. But before we do that and talk about that, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, of course. First, thank you so much for the invitation, Ambrose. It is really a pleasure to talk with you. And about myself, I consider my trajectory a little bit atypical. I'm originally from Argentina. I did my undergraduate studies in architecture in Buenos Aires. Following, I came to Philadelphia, where I received my master's in architecture degree at the University of Pennsylvania. Then after graduating, I worked for 2 years in the office of Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates. Then I moved back to Buenos Aires for a few years, where I led my professional practice. And after that, in 2005, I returned to Philadelphia, this time with my wife and 2 kids, where I again opened my professional practice here in Philadelphia. And I would like to point out that while I was working as a designer, as an architect, both in Buenos Aires and Philadelphia, I was also teaching part-time at various universities. And I was also contributing to Suma Plus magazine, which is the most prestigious magazine, architectural magazine in Argentina, and for which I wrote more than 40 articles. So a key moment, it was around 2012 when I started my PhD on architectural theory in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, which I completed in 2016. And the primary outcome of that experience was my first book titled Unexpected Affinities, where more or less I examined how the concept of type can become a design tool. In 2018, I was hired and I became totally completely immersed into academia. I was hired as an associate professor of architecture at Temple University in Philadelphia, where my teaching focuses on history, theory, and urban design. In a preliminary conversation, you asked me, well, tell a little bit about the school, about Temple. The School of Design is called Tyler, and I think it has an interesting feature, is Tyler School of Art and Architecture, where we're all under the same umbrella. For instance, currently I am co-teaching a graduate seminar on modern art and architecture in Sao Paulo, Brazil. My colleague is an art historian, and so half the class is architecture, the other half are art histories, and we really engage. Now we were finishing the course. We're really engaging in discussions not only about art and architecture in Sao Paulo and Brazil, but in general, what is the relationship between art and architecture? So in 2019, I decided to sort of move into my next research and publication process, and associated with my colleague and friend, Gregory Marinic from the University of Cincinnati, and where together we started what would become a multi-year research and publication project on informal urbanism in Latin America. Um, our and a little bit this is I'm telling a little bit about the book. The research focuses on analyzing urban and architectural strategies for intervening informal settlements.
Yeah.
And the five main cities we focus on are Rio de Janeiro, Medellin, Sao Paulo, Tijuana, and Buenos Aires. And you already mentioned the primary outcome of this research is the book Urban Labyrinth.
I assume, and maybe I'm being rather narrow here, but I assume that your experience as a Latin American and in Brazil and Argentina has obviously brought you face to face with urban informality, perhaps in a way that up here in the global north, certainly in Britain, where I am, informality is something that we see on the television. We hear occasional news stories about slumlords, and it looks a bit like informality, but it's not that same kind of giant scale. I'm assuming that's right, that you would see in Rio de Janeiro or Medellin or.
I have to tell you, give you an answer that I might or no, either disappoint you or give you a sense of reality. When I was a student and actually also an instructor in Buenos Aires, and I also taught briefly in Mexico, in Monterrey, but especially I have echoes very, very strong my experience as a student in Argentina. We never ever discussed the question of informality. This was in the 90s, was obviously a different era, different
Mm,
time. But it was something that it was a phenomenon. We coexist. We obviously, you drive around, you move around, and you would see a favela, or in Argentina they are called villas. You would see them, but it was not a topic that would be discussed at school. And I have to say, I was exposed to the idea that is something that could be considered from a design point of view by a colleague and friend of mine whose name is Flavio Hanches. I discussed one of his initiatives in the book, in the chapter dedicated to Buenos Aires. But it was about 10 years ago that I attended a lecture by him, and he explained how after the economic crisis in Argentina in 2001, that the number of people living in informality grew exponentially. Flavio and his team began to carry out several interventions in informal settlements on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. And seeing his work, I realized that as an architect, as an urban designer, he was facing completely new problems and challenges. And
mm.
so that that was the little spark that opened my curiosity. And I realized this is a critical subject. Obviously, I began to be more familiar. Nowadays, 1 out of 7 people all around the world live in informal settlements. So is, in my view, the most important urban challenge that the world is facing. So all this combined thought me, well, I need to focus on this subject. It's a fascinating subject. It's a necessary subject. And because I'm from Latin America, I focus on this region.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's really interesting also that it's after your kind of engagement with art and architecture that you turn your mind towards, I suppose, the ethical imperative, the moral imperative. It strikes me that there is a field of architecture which has no interest outside the provision of very lovely things for very expensive people and institutions. And then it's through art practice and perhaps artistic thinking that we gain this kind of criticality that allows us both to question whether that's good enough, but also to see in informality lessons and richnesses and problematize that and perhaps search for solutions. I mean, is that fair? Do you feel like your art
Yeah,
background was instrumental in this?
yeah, it is absolutely. It's fair to say. And I have to say, this is something we mentioned in the introduction, but if you look in the long history of architecture, practically started from Vitruvius, and particularly if you think about the treatises since the Renaissance, they barely mention, not to mention informality, they don't mention any project for the most poor, the most humble segment of the population. Most projects that are shown are palazzos, churches, castles, uh, uh, important building, etc., but there's no housing for the poor. It's only in the early 20th century that this begins to be a subject that was worthwhile for architects. That is when there is a focus on social housing. So it's only the 20th century that we begin to see that. So I think it's a big question that architecture as a discipline should face, that is that historically we haven't paid too much attention to the needs of 90% of the population. It's terrible to say, but it's like that. I cannot think of medicine, something like that, that it would be medicine that only focuses on 5 or 10% of the population and they disregards the needs of the rest. So I think it's something that I'm still processing, but I think it's quite, I find it quite remarkable.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I want to come to the title of your book, which has got this, which is rather gorgeous, Urban Labyrinths. And maybe we can come on to that in a second. Well, no, maybe we start with that. Why
Yeah.
urban labyrinths? Maybe we can start with that. And maybe you can use that as a way to, I suppose, present what informality means, generally speaking, and then in the specific condition of Latin America, which I know is a bit of a general place. I mean, what happens in Brazil is probably what is different to what happens in Argentina, but nonetheless. So why urban labyrinths?
Yeah, when the idea of the labyrinth, I think, is very, very present when you're navigating in any of the favelas or informal settlements. And that made me think about the notion of the labyrinth and how present it is in so much of our of Latin American literature. And you could go from Garcia Marquez to Octavio Paz, and perhaps most well known is Jorge Luis Borges and all his stories about labyrinths. And very occasionally, these use labyrinths as a sort of a metaphor, as a political metaphor of a continent or country or a city that doesn't have a clear path forward. So it's something that you may get lost and you need to decipher. So that was the origin of this title, which we find it intriguing, and it connects with sort of mostly with the literature history of Latin America, but it's also a very strong reality. And I was fascinated when, after defining that title, but I sort of as part of my research, I found a very, very interesting thinker and writer. Her name is Paola Berenstein, and it's a work that is titled Estética da Guinja, that in Portuguese that hasn't been translated. That would be the aesthetics of the marginal. That would be more or less the translation. And a chapter of that book, she describes all the aesthetics of she analyzes the favelas from as a labyrinthic experience. So, and that was a completely unconnected to this idea of title in our book Labyrinth. So we realize that there are many echoes of many instances for considering a labyrinth. And the question why Latin America, and I think the key thing of Latin America is that sadly is the most unequal region in the world. Is where you see most extremes of rich, of wealthy people, and also of poverty. But at the same time, I consider it a sort of intellectual and academic powerhouse with very strong university, with very strong research institutions, many thinkers, intellectuals studying and analyzing these questions. And I have to say, from sociological, anthropological, economic, etc., from many points of view. I think that is a reason one of the reasons I emphasize on Latin America. And finally, I think it's interesting that you say I can see seen from abroad, he said, well, is it the same a favela in Rio than in Sao Paulo or Medellin and Buenos Aires? And I think obviously there are very, very strong common features. I think there is a process of building informality that is self-built, etc., that there are many, many common features. There are many the redundancy in commonalities, and obviously there at the same time, there are different. Many occasions, the difference is more than anything else from the topographic. It's not the same thing to build and intervene and to work when the favela is on a hill that when it is flat. So there are many differences, and there are sort of sociological and cultural idiosyncrasies that are specific from each country. But at the same time, sometimes if I looking for photos, I may find a photo that for a presentation of a favela in Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, and sometimes I get I might get confused because there is this way of doing yourself and building yourself and self-building that makes everything, all these experiences have a very, very strong common features.
I see. I was just thinking as you were talking about that, because that hadn't struck me before. Because obviously we think about national boundaries, think Brazil's informal settlements, favelas, and Argentina's. What did you call them again? This was a new word.
Villa, like villas, but we
Villa.
pronounce the double L
Yeah.
stronger, villas.
Villas.
Yeah, and the full name is really is one of the issues that that we want to address. That is the language and the pejorative language. The full name that is known in Argentina is Villa Miseria. That would be misery shantytown. That is a completely pejorative expression. Now there is a tendency to rename them as neighborhood or barrios, but in so many places, the word that is used for the informal settlements in Latin America and in English also, the word slum is extremely pejorative, so I try to avoid using that word, but it's so much ingrained in our languages. So, and I think that is one of the key challenges we need to face.
I guess the question is, why do we need to face it?
Well, you don't want to cast a group of people calling them in a pejorative way.
No,
So
no,
in
no.
Argentina, very common to call them villeros, that are people from
I
there,
see. I
and
see.
you don't want them to feel that their children or themselves find a case of embarrassment. Sometimes there is a process of changing that meaning. A key point is in Brazil, sorry, that the favelas. There's a group called G10 that are the 10 largest favelas in Brazil. They develop a kind of a big umbrella, and they are creating within the favela dance schools and cultural projects, etc. And they reclaim the word favelado or somebody from the favela as a positive thing. So in that case, it's great that they adopt that and say, well, we are proud to be from there and we are a strong community. But if it's something that it has a pejorative expression, I think we need to acknowledge as well.
Oh, for sure. And I wouldn't question that, but I think that there has to be recognized that in writing a book about informal settlements, you have tacitly projected a critique. And that's not of the people. The people are wonderful, but people will live anywhere. People will live under the most extreme duress and still have birthday parties and christenings and dance and sing and make love and all of these things. That's a given. The problem, of course, is that the assumed or the implicit problem in the very fact of your book is that this is an insufficient setting for human activity. And I think that maybe we could understand why that might be if perhaps the definitions were clearer. So if we don't use words like slum, if we hide the word, we hide the reality of the condition that 1 billion people in the world have to live in, which is without medical care, without proper policing, without fire safety, without tenure, without clean water, and so on and so forth. But how do you define? I mean, do you work with a technical definition of informality in your book?
I have to say, it's a tricky question. You can try to unpack it. First thing we did is look at the dictionary, and it's both, I think, in English and in Spanish. I think both the Webster and the Oxford. define informal as something that has no form. So it's like almost nothing. It's like something that doesn't, lacking form, something like that.
An informal settlement will expand to fill the container it's in.
Yeah, so, but obviously that if we're thinking about somebody that lives in an informal, in a neighborhood, informal neighborhood, and to tell them that you have no form, obviously that is something missing.
Mm-hmm.
From a technical point of view, from urbanism, usually when we talk about informal settlements, they are defined as sort of residential areas where people live without legal sort of framework. And often lack basic services and sometimes urban infrastructure. But however, that also is not enough because, and we discuss in our study that there are many favelas that the residents have obtained tenure of the property and that they are connected to sewage and potable water and electrical networks, but however, they are considered favelas. So it's in either way is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And also there's a third way, which comes from more our discipline, that is say, well, if you think about formal versus informal, you can equate to planned versus non-planned. And usually the favelas were not planned, or they were not designed from an urbanistically point of view. And the same can be said about architecture, that if design or not design. But of course, you can say that most of the vernacular tradition was not per se design, was done none by designers or architects. So I think all these definitions, they are approximations eventually, and almost on a rude way. In our book, we say, well, it was this famous a senator in the United States in the 60s that I say, well, I don't know how to design pornography, but when I can I can identify when I see it. And I think a little bit favelas or informal settlements is a bit like that. It's hard to have a definition that covers everything because you'd always find so many exceptions. But eventually, when you are discussing of conditions of people living in this situation, I think we realize we can identify those.
I've always tried to, come up with a nice, clean and neat definition for these. It is housing without tenure.
It's slippery, yeah.
It's slippery. And it's very, it is very interesting. Even the language, since I've read about informality, the language around it has shifted quite a lot. What at the level of policy, I suppose, at the level of strategy, how has this quote unquote problem of informality been addressed in the context of your research?
And I think here is partially because it's one of the main points of the book is that Latin America was a leader both in terms of governance and on actual implementation. The first large-scale municipal program for a large city that contained interventions in favelas or informal settlements was Rio de Janeiro. The program was coined Favela Barrio, which the word itself is nice, that is trying to connect or make a transition between the favela and the formal settlements and convert it or bring the positive qualities of a barrio that is a neighborhood. So it would be from informal to neighborhood. So that was a little bit was encapsulated in those two words. This was started in the 1990s, in 1993 in Rio de Janeiro. And of course, a key thing is that you need multiple actors. In this case, you have obviously the major, but very important two figures that were Luis Paulo Conde and Sergio Magalhães, Conde was the director of urbanism and Magalhães the director of housing, and they devised a multiplicity of interventions, of making many interventions, started with small scale, then medium and large scale interventions in favela. And how would they be organized? Each intervention, they decided, and I think was very smart, an open competition, but each team should include from engineers, architects, etc., but also sociologists, economists, and social workers. So it should be a truly interdisciplinary task.
Mm.
And the project itself always contained, the physical project contained two phases. First was the building of the infrastructure and urban services in case they didn't have, such as connecting to sewage, paving roads, providing drinking water, etc. And secondly, and there is a good definition by one of the architects who worked there that he calls it invisible urbanism. This was Jorge Jauregui, who work in the favela barrios. So it's something that you end up not seeing whatever happens under the road. But second is the creation of new public spaces and public buildings, such as public squares and parks and schools and sports fields, community halls and health clinics, etc. And that is usually what you end up seeing. And of course, how was that done? Obviously, it was very important that it was a big funding from the Inter-American Development Bank and the federal funding from the government of Brazil and funding from the municipal funding from the Rio de Janeiro. So you have to combine these three. So it was obviously you need a political backing here. So everything starts with the politics.
Mm.
And that was Rio de Janeiro in 1993. And 10 years later was another, which I think is a key experience.
But just sorry to interrupt, but what was the objective with this? I mean, was it democratization? Was it an ethical question? Was it one of a kind of moral imperative again at the level of participatory democracy? Or was it very simply they wanted to regularize the economies? They needed, it was a net weight on the kind of urban economy, and by regularizing it, they would activate more citizens. I mean, I guess a little bit of everything.
It's a great question. It was more or less 10 years after Brazil returned to democracy. It was in the early 80s that returned to democracy after military dictatorship. The military dictatorship completely disregard any project of interventions in favelas. And suddenly in Brazil and in the rest of Latin America, but obviously Brazil, because the problem of the favela is so much visible, there was a big production of works and books and studies of analysis, etc., of the phenomenon of the favela, which is, let's say, is a relatively new phenomenon of the 20th century, and in most places is the second half of the 20th century. And I think, fortunately, many politicians and many other actors begin to realize we need to do something for these communities. They live with us. They're not going to go away. For many decades through the 20th century, the official strategy was to eradicate them and demolish them and try to make them invisible. Obviously, they would come back and they would rebuild where they were displaced. So the realization, well, the favelas, they're not going to disappear. We need to enhance the quality of life. So there was a common agreement that this was necessary. Of course, once you decide that is how to do, because if not that you could look at manuals in the 1990s of decades of history or centuries of experience doing that. So I think the big as a virtue of the two people I mentioned, Conde and Magallanes, is that they devise a strategy, an urban strategy for intervening here. So
It's really interesting that you mentioned this thing. I was giving a talk earlier today, funnily enough, at a local secondary school, high school in America, to some 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds about the identity of architecture. I was doing it as part of our outreach and at the university here. And I used this set of 3 slides, which I took from Libius Woods' website. And they're aerial photographs of the golf course at Port-au-Prince the day before the 2010 earthquake, 4 days later, on the 16th of January, and then 1 year later. And obviously, just after the earthquake, the golf course is converted for relocation for people in crisis and whose properties need to be cleared and so on. And 1 year later, it's completely solidly urbanized, informally. And you can see it's informal, even though it's an aerial photograph, because of the telltale blue tarpaulin, which indicates self-built. And I suppose I was rather romantically describing it to the students. I was looking at the urban grain of it. And I was explaining how you can start to actually see a kind of logic of architectural design, of urban design, a strong identity. There's primary roads, secondary roads, tertiary roads. There seems to be civic spaces. But what you seem to suggest is that actually, following this example in Rio, that these spaces to be improved need the implementation of civic amenity. That this is not naturally, and I use that word carefully, I don't mean like animals, but this is not something that self-organizing communities of informality will produce themselves. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely right. I have to say, there have been through the last decades of the 20th century many small initiatives of improving the conditions, but they were usually uh, very, very small expressions. Perhaps in the northern hemisphere, the most well-known case was John Turner, who worked in what they call barriadas, the informal settlements in the outskirts of Lima in Peru. And so he became well known because later he transmitted or converted all his experience in his book Freedom to Build and something
Yeah,
and
yeah.
a second book. And there was a similar case of in terms of scale and scope, etc., in Rio in the 1970s and 80s, whose name was Carlos Nelson, who also did very, very small projects in favelas, like to creating a little community center, etc. And I have to say, I'm not religious, but I have to say the Catholic Church and many churches also did a lot of work through this time, but always were very, very small scale initiatives. Nothing, there was no urban plan for this. So that's why I'm saying the first time that there is a large scale urban plan initiative with a lot of support and funding was in Rio de Janeiro. So I think that is why I consider it sort of a turning point. It's not that there was nothing before, but nothing in that scale and nothing that had such impressive sort of results and scope.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I interrupted you when you were about to tell the story of the Argentine example.
No, I actually chronologically the one that came later, which is usually considered the best example or model, is Medellin in Colombia, and which started exactly 10 years after the Rio de Janeiro experience. And something that I emphasize in the book, which I think is my idea beautiful, is the sharing of knowledge, of the transmission of knowledge and expertise. Before starting everything, the main actors in Medellin, they went to Rio, they interacted with the people there, they learned from the experience, and then they implemented their process that eventually was nicknamed social urbanism. And in many ways, the experience in Medellin improves what they did in Rio. They take into considerations, they change the scope rather than trying to do Rio. If you see a map, it look like a like a volleyball of like a mini points scattered through all the city. And while in Medellin, they focus a lot in one area that they call integral urban project. And then they would do all the intervention there. They completely transform the neighborhood, and then they would move to another. So they modify the strategies, which I think is interesting, but a process. I think a process of learning experience. So and the initiative that started later in Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires that I mentioned, obviously in many ways they learned from the experiences of Rio and Medellin.
Again, I'm struck by this idea of the territory of Latin America as a kind of, if not holistic, but certainly informality itself seems to exist not in relation to national boundaries, and then the solutions and the sort of management or the kind of strategies to address it seem to also transcend these national boundaries, which I think is fascinating. Have you found, and has it been found in these communities, that the populations of these informal settlements themselves are not, I suppose, dependent upon or fixed by national boundaries? That people, through processes of rural to urban migration, are moving, say, from Paraguay to Argentina, that the whole process is informal, that the notion of Paraguay and Argentina in some kind of way becomes sort of meaningless when you're building informal settlements.
Yeah, that's a is a is a trademark. This idea that is the origins of informal settlements, if people is displacement, is migration. In many cases, in Brazil, the most common is, you said, from the northeast of Brazil, which is the most impoverished region of the country, going to Rio and Sao Paulo. In the case of Argentina, it's transnational. You have people, as you mentioned, from Paraguay, from Bolivia, and even from Peru, moving from those countries into Argentina, and particularly to Buenos Aires.
Mm-hmm.
The chapter that we dedicate to Buenos Aires. The main case study is what is called Villa 31, and now is called Barrio Mujica, that is a neighborhood located within the city of Buenos Aires, and 50% of the population is foreign, is from the countries that I mentioned. They are from Paraguay, Bolivia, and Peru. So you realize that it begins to be very, very much a transnational process. And
do you see that reflected in the actual form of the informality? Are those populations, do they bring a kind of indigeneity local to their heritage into the manufacturing of this, or is the melting pot of the informal settlement a kind of way of generating a singularity? You know, it's like you don't get little Uruguay over here and little Paraguay over here and little Bolivia over here.
Frankly, I don't. It's hard to see it from an experiential point of view. When you're walking through the neighborhood, you don't see that little Paraguay, etc. Yes, you see that in the food and in the clothing, etc. Maybe my eyes should be a little bit more anthropologically oriented, and I could detect, but you don't see that clearly
Mm.
in the sort of the built environment.
Mm.
I personally didn't see that.
Mm.
It was not the main objective of our
No.
research, but yes, you can see in a lot of the food, particularly, and the way
Yeah.
they dress. And it was very interesting, particularly in the case of Buenos Aires, when they started formalizing the neighborhood and they had to name the streets. The streets up to that point didn't have names. The name of the streets incorporate the background of these communities. So they have names related to Paraguayan, Bolivian, and Peruvian traditions. So you begin to see this kind of sort of a hybridization or acknowledgement of where the people are coming from.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, also, you can see, and now I was remember what I was saying in Medellin, very often you have murals that reflect the countryside where many of those people originally came, that they came from rural areas. So, and that is reflected in many murals, and they acknowledge there's always a little text in the mural that they acknowledge this is where we were coming from.
How is architecture playing its role in here? Now, obviously, your book mentions a number of, you mentioned Teddy Cruz and von Forman, for example, and you've already mentioned, this idea of the generation of public spaces, strategic thinking in places like Buenos Aires and so on. How is architecture as a discipline now engaging with this? And is it through the top-down process of kind of urban planning these places, or is it trying to adopt a more kind of, I suppose, situated and contextual response?
Well, I think your question has two sides. First, I think you're almost implying how was the community considered, which I think is a very critical subject and relatively a new subject. And from the start, from Rio, there was in all initiatives was this idea that you have to do consultation sessions with the community. And if you're going to design a school, you need to discuss with the community where would be the entrance, if it would be open on weekends to other parts of the community, would they have evening classes or not, what would be the security reasons, and obviously the appearance of the school. So all these things are discussed. You cannot think of a building that is like it brings it from a helicopter and drop in the middle of a neighborhood, because it won't work. You need to make it porous. You make it connect with the community, and at the same time, doing this research, there was a big realization that we architects are not trained to to engage with communities. So we need to have the assistance or help or the leadership of community workers, sociologists, etc., who are have been trained and educated to do that. So I think that is a very important thing. In general, I think it's wonderful that it became a norm that there has to be consultation sessions with the community. Is almost included. It's like part of the playbook. Of course, doing the research, I also heard critical voices that these consultations were not good enough, or that they didn't consider every aspect of the community. And it's a realization that is tough, that is not easy, that is, and is a sort of case by case. So that is about the consultation with the community. And in terms of the architecture, I think that is the reason I decided to write the book, that I realized finally, from my point of view, architecture as a discipline, and I have to say in a broader sense, that includes urban design and includes landscape design, etc., all the design of the environment disciplines, finally are addressing really the needs of and the desires of the most needed segments of the population. So I think that is very, very important to emphasize. And also when I think architecture, I don't think only of the designers, but also includes the theoreticians, the critics, the historians. That is a really sort of a large effort, including I think our conversation nowadays is to we have people be aware that architecture can play a role. I don't know if you want to talk, if I could elaborate a little bit on the design itself.
Yeah, I would like to hear that, because this is a very different type of architecture. If in architecture schools we kind of still focus quite a lot on buildings as objects, buildings with a strong boundary, and this is partly due to time constraints and curriculum constraints and assessment criteria and all of these kind of metrics that we have to sit by. How do you assess community participation? How do you give credits for this? But it is a different form of design, isn't it? This is a process. This is about temporality. This is about relationship. It's almost like the architect as social worker in a way.
Yeah, almost as we say here in the States, and I guess in English, that you have to use many hats.
Yeah.
And so the architect has to, at some moment, be a little bit a social worker, a sort of a social activist, has to be a listener. But also, I have to say, and here there is a debate, what should be the aesthetics of this new intervention? And many cases, the interventions are the sort of the aesthetic is almost the opposite of what is the aesthetics of the informality, where you see, and I think the most sort of crystal clear examples are in Medellin, when you see a community center or a library park or a school, and is very geometrically defined, very clearly defined, and it's not that it's aggressive against the community, but it's almost stating this is something new, this is and this is special, and this is design. And for some, interesting enough, that people accepted it, and when I was thinking of that, is that, well, this is almost like in medieval towns that you have a cathedral, well, it has to be different from the rest of the town because it has a different purpose, a different meaning, and it's shared by the whole community. You don't want the the cathedral to have this little sort of very, very segmented form, but something that stands out. Obviously, this is a generalization, but I think in general, the schools, the library parks, the community centers, I find it very interesting that they are in contrast to the rest of the community, but in contrast from a formal point of view or geometrical point of view. At the same time, they are, and I think it's very porous, they are very open, very a lot of intermediate spaces where there is a kind of blending between urban design, landscape design, and architecture. You see almost also the weather in Medellin helps a lot, that you feel that almost the nature is filtered into the buildings. But so this is one of the key things that I find interesting, that the architecture in many cases is used as a counterpoint to the existing urban fabric.
Is it used as a corrective? Is it a sort of like a Victorian imperialist going in and saying, look here, you need to build more like this because you could be like us if you just pulled your socks up and tried harder?
I don't think so. I think that there is a recession. One thing is the domestic scale that is self-built,
Okay.
and something I we can expand soon, that is what happens with the housing, but let's leave that soon. But there is a realization. One thing is the self-built, that is improvisational, that it will change, continuously change through generations, that suddenly a family has 4 members, then you have 2, and then you have 6, so that that building or that house accommodates to those changes. So it's a continuously being morphed and transformed. And the other thing is something that is like a community center, that is a more stable presence, and that is not done according to one person's need, but it's something to be sort of a neutral space that should address the needs of the whole community. So it has to be like kind of a more generic, almost or more neutral kind of space or building.
But at the same time can be very designed. I mean, I'm looking here at the book on Medellin and Colegio Antonio Durca and Santo Domingo Savio from 2008. This is definitive. It's almost like a high modernist slash
Absolutely.
meets brutalist. I mean, it's beautiful.
Absolutely, and it's a monument in
Yeah,
many
yeah,
ways,
for sure. But
monumental in many ways, but it has terraces, has roof terraces, so it is monumental, but also has many features that it makes it, well, it is very horizontal. So, but yeah, it's a great project, but again, and also you have a diversity of architects. In Medellin, each project was again done as a competition, did allow many young Colombian architects to do their first project in doing these kind of programs. And they are all part of the basis of the competition was that they have to engage the community and engage in this case, in the case of the school, the teachers and all the administrators that would be surrounding it. And so that is, and that is one case. I think in that case, I think it's a very interesting and nice design, but there are others that they have different approaches.
I do find that very interesting that the architects themselves are acting in this designerly way. They are bringing to bear on the community their professional knowledge, their expertise, part of which is a kind of understanding of forms and volumes and aesthetics and material selection and so on and so forth. So it's sensitive design that isn't pointlessly humble to the point where the architect has no significant voice in the space, which I like. I do want to come across to this idea of that you mentioned, which is around housing, which I'm assuming remains largely self-built, or self-built in the sense that it's not built through professional contractual arrangements.
Yeah, I think, and it's a subtitle of my conclusion that is titled "Everything but Housing." Is obviously is an exaggeration. there were cases that they built new housing, but the criteria, the modus operandi, it was to the intervention to do everything that the individual or the family couldn't do. That is infrastructure, transportation, schools, community center, health clinic. So everything, pocket park, etc. You cannot do by yourself to pave a road or to make a sewage or to build a school, but yes, you can improve your house. So that was the main strategy, is many cases assist the self-construction process, give them whatever technical supervision for structure, if you need a structural engineer to make sure that is well supported, a connection to sewage if it needed, materials or painting, but eventually to leave the houses building process for themselves and concentrate in everything else, in everything but the housing itself. So, which I think I found it like a different kind of the opposite paradigm of what was modernism. Modernism was the main program was housing. If you have to think about what did modernism offered to humanity in terms of a project of social interest was housing. And this is almost the opposite of that which, and I think it's only in a few decades from the 70s to nowadays, it changed 180 degrees.
How have architecture schools been involved in this? Now, I only ask because a long time ago, I read a paper, and I've just brought it up on my screen here, by Margarita Green and Eduardo Rojas, called Incremental Construction, a strategy to facilitate access to housing. And I think it was about a case in Quito. I can't remember specifically, but the architecture schools had turned their attention to providing a kind of pop-up design service for people in an informal settlement. Is there any equivalent still going on?
I think the last decade, 2 decades, I would say, since the early 2000s, there has been a big, important change in mainly Latin America, but in many other parts of the world. And finally, what the experience I had that is going through the university in Buenos Aires and never ever hearing a discussion about informality, now that has changed very, very abruptly. And part of the curriculum is addressing projects for different kinds of informal settlements on different scales, etc. It's part of the literature, discussed, etc. And there are many initiatives of doing these design and build mini projects to facilitate in the community.
Yeah.
I am more familiar with cases because of my background, etc., in Buenos Aires, that through the University of Buenos Aires, that they did projects of different kinds, that the students would build some kind of facility or some kind of element that needed to be done, or kiosk, etc., for the impoverished communities. So I think it's a wonderful news because it's those students, not only they are doing something useful for other people, but later they will keep on thinking about that. And that you see, and again, I go back to Medellin, you see many of those who were in the 2000s working in those projects. They were very young, in the late 20s or 30s, now are in their 50s. And I follow them and I'm sort of friend of some of them, and they still have that sort of social sensibility. And they do houses for rich people and they do house project for corporations, but at the same time, they are always very, very much open to use their knowledge and their expertise for these kind of community-driven projects.
I want to finish on one final theme, which I think is important to the whole discussion around urban informality. And correct me if I'm wrong, but if there's 1 billion people living in informal settlements, this is an issue of sustainability, I suppose we could call it broadly. How does one, or how do architects, how do designers help improve, I suppose, the performance of informal settlements from the perspective of the 3 aspects of sustainability, but particularly around the ecological concerns?
I think it's a very, very big question. There is a realization that if you have 1 billion people to build, I don't know, and by now it's like 1.3 billion people, and to build new housing for all of them, for all those people, would be an ecological explosion of the amount of concrete and steel and brick, etc. So it is almost impossible to think that you could build from scratch all the the housing needs for all the population. So it's another reason that it would be impossible, and obviously it's practically impossible. So that is one thing. That is the realization that the best solution is to improve the existing condition of the informal settlements or favelas rather than try to to create something from scratch, right? That you can consider from many points of view, including from sustainable. Part of my research, I said, well, how did this project deal with sustainability? And it's clear that in the early 1990s, it was not so much in the radar. And every year it began to be a little bit more considered. And nowadays, so many things are like the treatment of drinking water, of recycling of materials, incorporation of solar energy. All these questions have been incorporated one way or another in many projects. So there is a consciousness of the importance of sustainability. And a project that I mentioned that I think became a sort of example by chance was in Sao Paulo, was the program called Mananciais. And the case was there were 130,000 families surrounded what was the main source of drinking water for the city, and that they were contaminating those dams, those basins. And with with the help of, I have it written here, with the help of the World Bank, the municipality of Sao Paulo, and the company Sabesp, that is the company that treats and provides drinking water for Sao Paulo, rather than try to displace those families, they decided it was better to provide those communities with sewage, drinking water, electrical, etc., to upgrade those settlements so they wouldn't contaminate the water. So you you see out of a problem, it came a solution, and it was a wonderful project of upgrading. I discuss in the book part of the project, including because they have to have a kind of a ribbon without any construction next to the water. So they built a sort of a very, very beautiful linear parks along those lines, along those lines of curves, etc. So, and this is, you could consider this a good example of how sustainable questions or pollution, etc., can be addressed while developing or building or providing a new infrastructure and new facilities for the communities.
To go back to the earlier part of our conversation where you talked about the sites and services approach to addressing informality as a sort of unseen urbanization. This approach to that you've described in places like Medellin, this approach to environmental questions and ecological questions is sort of like an unseen is like a seen unseen form of infrastructure. They're parts of the city that we take for granted and don't see perhaps, but are nonetheless more visible than the sewage pipes. But I was wondering, as a last point, what do we take from this? Is there something to take from this for the global north? When I started my PhD years back, I had hoped, and I was looking at informal communities in West India, in Gujarat. I had positioned it as a co-learning thing. And, you start a PhD, you've got big ideas. And I thought that I would do research in informal settlements in India, and then this would reveal very clear and obvious applicable lessons to the global north, which would be the conclusion of my incredibly world-changing doctorate. And on such hubris, my dreams died. But is there something to be taken from here? And I'm thinking particularly about in Tijuana, I think it is in your book, you talk about, for example, the section on the role of women. Is it in Tijuana? No, it's in Buenos Aires, I think. In one of the cases, no, Sao Paulo, women in command. You have a section talking about women in command. And there's this idea of kind of the way that informality articulates perhaps more marginalized voices within that. Is that perhaps the thing to take from here, or is there more practical, substantive, and spatial lessons as well?
Two things. First, I think it's great that you bring the case of Sao Paulo, of the women. And while I was doing the study, I realized in most cities and countries, the main actors were men. And it was a nice contrast that in Sao Paulo, the main leaders and actors, etc., are women, including Elizabeth Franza, who is the main leader of the CEJAVI, that is the company that the municipal company that is in charge of these projects. And so something that I found very interesting is talking with different experience, completely disconnected. That when I asked, for instance, what we've discussed before, the community meetings, and in 90%, those who go to this meeting and follow that meetings are women, and those become the community leaders, etc., are women. And you see photos of community participation and from places that are completely disconnected, like Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo and Tijuana. They are mostly dominated by women that are, I'm not an anthropologist, etc., but for some reason, they are the ones that engage more in topics of the community, which I think is fascinating. Mm. And you ask, what do we take from this? And I think, obviously, I feel good for the discipline of architecture and all the design that is capable of doing, using our knowledge, our ideas and theories and skills and graphic skills, etc., for initiatives like that. As I think that is obviously good. And this reminded me of, recently I gave a lecture here. We have a community college that is sort of like an intermediate university level. And they asked me, well, any of these things could be applied to Philadelphia, to an American cities. And I said, I was thinking, well, there's so very different problems. In the United States, the urban poverty is very different from the urban poverty in Latin America. They both exist. In the United States, it's very acute, the problem of homelessness, which in the favela is different. But if there's something that we can learn and extrapolate, and I have this very clear, is the importance of building schools, for instance. And you don't need to change a whole neighborhood to build a new school. But if you would see the state of the many public schools in urban situations in Philadelphia, they are truly calamitous. They're in very bad shape. And it's a complicated thing that the schools are based on the tax base of the immediate community. But that could be a relatively simple solution to build much better schools, and the schools associated with community centers that it could be used after hours, etc. And you would be betting for a better education, that it would be betting for the future. That is something that unfortunately most politicians don't think about, is to think, well, in 10 years your community will improve. But I think if there's one takeaway that I think we could learn about, is doing this kind of projects that are for the full community.
Fabulous. That's a great point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Pablo. It's been a delight to hear you talk.
Thank you so much.
The splintering of urbanism does not take place at the fissure between formality and informality, but rather in fractal fashion within the informalized production of space. Believe it or not, that's not a rapper, but in fact an aneuroi, who knows things. Thanks to Pablo for the honour of his company, book and shared knowledge, and to Routledge for the PDF. Please see the podcast description for links to Pablo, to his social media, and the book. And thanks for listening.